Hi, everyone. Welcome and good evening. My name is Lauren Artilles, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm thrilled to introduce this virtual event with Heather Clark, presenting her new book, Red Comet, The Short Life and Blazing Art of Sylvia Plath, in conversation with Maggie Doherty. I hope you're all well and safe. Thank you for joining us virtually tonight. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community during these challenging times. We're hosting 5 events a week right here on Zoom. And just like always, our event schedule will appear on our website at harvard.com, and you can sign up for our email newsletter for more updates. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to pre-order Red Comet, which comes out October 27th on harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of this series and our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. So thank you for showing up and tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings these last few months, technical issues may arise. And if they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. So thank you for your patience and understanding. And now I'm honored to introduce tonight's speakers. Heather Clark is the author of The Grief of Influence, Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes, and The Ulster Renaissance, Poetry in Belfast, 1962 through 1972. Her awards include a National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar Fellowship and a Visiting U.S. Fellowship at the Eccles Center for American Studies, British Library. Her work has appeared in publications including Harvard Review and the Times Literary Supplement, and she recently served as the scholarly consultant for the BBC documentary Sylvia Plath, Life Inside the Bell Jar. Maggie Doherty is a literary scholar, historian, and critic based at Harvard, where she earned her PhD in English and where she currently teaches writing, literature, and history. She is the author of The Equivalents, A Story of Art, Female Friendship, and Liberation in the 1960s, and her writing has appeared in many publications, including The New Republic, The New York Times, N+1, and The Nation. Tonight, they'll be discussing Heather's latest book, Red Comet, a meticulously researched look at one of the 20th century's most iconic and most mythologized poets. With compassion and deft scholarship, she illuminates the vivid complexities of a life so often eclipsed in the popular imagination by its end. Ruth Franklin calls Red Comet a spectacular achievement, saying, finally, the biography that Sylvia Plath deserves, one that takes her seriously as both a poet and a person. And Maggie Doherty says, Red Comet presents Sylvia Plath as she ought to be, as an innovative, ambition-driven artist at a time when women weren't supposed to be any of those things. In the end, I was awestruck by Plath's courage and strength in the face of so many obstacles, and I was awed, too, by the work Clark had done to bring this writer to life. And now I'm so excited to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is yours, Heather and Maggie.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And thank you, Heather, for writing this wonderful book. I love it. I love the book. I'm so thrilled to be here talking about it with you. I mean, it's a monumental achievement, but it is also a page turner. I think I read this book in a week, maybe. I flew through it. I couldn't stop reading. And I talked about it with everyone. I was texting my friends about it. I was talking my partner's ear off about it. I think I talked about it in therapy because it was so deep in the sense of not just bringing Plath to life, with which you do so well, but it's about so many more things. It's about being a mother and an artist. It's about being married to an artist, being married to another creative person and how you negotiate that. It's about being a woman. It's about all of the ways that we negotiate and handle our really intimate, difficult relationships. And it just touched me in so many ways. So I would love for you to read a little bit of it to us.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Maggie, for supporting the book in the ways that you have. I'm glad that you liked it, that it was a page turner. That's really amazing to hear. And I loved the equivalence as well. I thought it was fabulous. I learned so much about art and friendship between women in the 1960s, right in Cambridge, and the Radcliffe Institute. It was fantastic. So thank you for writing that book. And thank you to the Harvard Bookstore for hosting this. I spent many hours browsing through the corridors of the Harvard Bookstore when I was an undergraduate there. So it means a lot to be invited back to speak about my book. So thank you. So I'm going to read a short section from my prologue, and it's only about 3 minutes. So because I know sometimes reading doesn't go so well over Zoom, so I kept it short. But I wanted to read a section that gave a sense of Sylvia Plath's ambition and also what she was up against, which is a big theme in the book in general. So Sylvia Plath took herself and her desires seriously in a world that often refused to do so. She published her first poem at age 8 and later vowed to become the poetess of America. In the years that followed, Plath pursued her literary vocation with a fierce, tireless determination. She hoped to be a writer, wife, and mother, but she was raised in a culture that openly derided female artistic ambition. Such derision is clear in the speech Democratic presidential candidate Adlai Stevenson gave at Plath's 1955 Smith College commencement, titled "A Purpose for Modern Woman." The best way these brilliant graduates could contribute to their nation, Stevenson said, was to embrace, quote, "the humble role of housewife," which statistically is what most of you are going to be, whether you like the idea or not just now. And you'll like it. Stevenson, the liberal darling of his day, went on, and I'm quoting, "This assignment for you as wives and mothers has great advantages. In the first place, it is homework. You can do it in the living room with a baby in your lap, or in the kitchen with a can opener in your hands. If you're really clever, maybe you can even practice your saving arts on that unsuspecting man while he's watching television." Stevenson acknowledged, quote, "the sense of contraction, the lost horizons," unquote, these women would feel in their new domestic roles. Once they wrote poetry, he mused, now it's the laundry list. They had hoped to play their part in the crisis of the age, but what they do is wash diapers. Stevenson hoped this view was not too depressing, but concluded that, quote, "women never had it so good as you do." Sylvia Plath was determined to play her part, but as Stevenson's speech suggests, the odds were against her. She lived in a shamelessly discriminatory age when it was almost impossible for a woman to get a mortgage, loan, or credit card, when newspapers divided their employment ads between men and women. Attractive, please. The word pregnant was banned from network television, and popular magazines encouraged wives to remain quiet because, as one advice columnist put it, quote, "his topics of conversation are more important than yours." Government, finance, law, media, academia, medicine, technology, science, nearly all the professions were controlled by men. Some women made inroads, but the costs were high. As one of Plath's Cambridge contemporaries wrote, women in the 1950s had, quote, "internalized from a lifetime of messages that achievement and autonomy were simply incompatible with love and family, and that independence equaled loneliness." Still, Plath thought a different fate from the one Stevenson had predicted for her might be possible. Like her Joycean hero, Stephen Dedalus, she was filled with, in her words, Icarian lust. She would seek out her destiny abroad, collect experience for her art, and stay in motion. Anything to evade the life not lived, the poem not written, the love not realized. Plath spread her wings over and over at a time when women were not supposed to fly.
Thank you. I mean, it's one of the things that I love so much about this book is how powerfully you demonstrate the odds that were against her, that you really, really show again and again just how difficult it was to be an independent woman, let alone an artist, let alone an ambitious artist. And, you know, it really made me see Plath in a new light. I think I speak for probably a lot of people when I say I thought I knew her. I thought, you know, I'd heard about her. I really thought I knew her story. I wrote about her in my book, and then sort of after reading your book was kind of horrified at how thin my description was. But I guess it made me wonder what motivated you to write this biography. What made you think that we needed a new version of Plath when so many of us think we know her story?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really fair question because I think at this point there are 8 or 9 biographies of Plath, and so I was very aware of this as I was considering this idea of writing a biography of Sylvia Plath, that I would really have to justify, you know, why another one to a publisher. And there's just the practical reason that there hadn't been a long, serious, critical biography of Sylvia Plath. And, you know, Hermione Lee's biography of Virginia Woolf really inspired me. And I felt like Sylvia Plath deserved a big book like that. She deserved that kind of 3-inch spine, and she deserved to take up space on the shelf, on that bookstore shelf. And so I felt that I wanted to sort of redress this kind of gap in knowledge, and also there were a lot of new letters that were going to be coming out. Sylvia Plath's Collected Letters was published in 2018, and I knew that was happening years before, so I knew that was in the pipeline. I knew that, again, all of these new letters would be coming to light that helped shed light on her life. I knew there would be new archives opening. I knew there was more in the Ted Hughes archives at Emory and the British Library. I knew there was a lot more to be kind of mined there. So that was another reason that I just thought, well, there's a lot of new material coming to light. But I think emotionally, I was angry. I was angry about the ways that she had been pathologized in previous biographies and in the media. The critic Maggie Nelson says, and I quote her in my introduction, she says, "To be called the Sylvia Plath of anything is a bad thing." And that just broke my heart, you know. And I don't think Maggie Nelson was agreeing with that, but she was just making a cultural observation. And this idea that Plath had become synonymous with madness and tragedy and suicide, and I just thought that her legacy, her creative legacy, had sort of been diminished, and I wanted to try to dismantle some of those reductive cliches and really focus on her life as a writer, and her ambition and her wit and her energy and her drive and her incredible strength. I mean, I wanted to focus on that, of course, not minimizing the fact that she suffered from depression very severely at times. But, you know, again, I mentioned Hermione Lee. One of her quotes was so important to me, and I think this is sort of the sentence that made me decide I had to write this book. I was reading her short introduction to biography, which is masterful, by the way. It's one of these Oxford these OUP short introductions. They're about 90 pages long. And she says in that, women whose lives have involved abuse, self-harm, mental illness, and suicide are often treated as victims first and psychological case histories first, and professional writers second. And when I read that, I thought that was really true of Sylvia Plath. And I wanted to at least try to treat her as the professional writer first, as Hermione Lee, advises. And so that was sort of the idea that lit the fire and that kept me going. And if there was one sentence that I had running through my mind throughout the 8 years that I spent researching and writing this book, it was a very simple sentence. It was just, what made Sylvia Plath the writer that she became? And that was what I would always try to come back to, when I was feeling so overwhelmed by the enormous amount of information, feeling archive fatigue, that kind of thing. I would just try to come back to that simple question, what made her the writer that she became, and try to focus on that. So yeah, I mean, that's there are many different facets of it, the practical reason that she didn't have a big biography, and I feel that we need to have more big biographies of women. That's really important. So it almost felt like a political act, writing 1,000 pages about a woman writer.
Yeah.
It was much longer.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll get to that. I'm curious.
So what you're reading has been like really cut down.
Yeah, that is remarkable to me. Yeah. But so I mean, you were saying there was all this research to be done. There were all these materials that people hadn't used.
Yeah.
I imagine that was a huge and difficult and maybe also exciting undertaking for you. I'm just curious, what was the research like for this? Where did you go? What did it feel like to be looking at these materials maybe that hadn't been looked at before?
Yeah, I mean, it was, well, I love working in archives. And I think those of us who work in archives, we become addicted to them, right? We want to keep going back and back. We get archive fever. And I did experience archive fatigue, but never for long enough to stay away. So yeah, I knew from having written my second book about Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes, I thought I had a pretty good critical foundation, and I knew where all the archival collections were, most of them anyway. And I had already done a lot of the archival research for it, but going to, I think I hadn't really done a lot of the kind of following in the footsteps of your subject, that kind of research, because the second book was quite academic, and I wanted this book to really be a very accessible, readable biography, and I wanted to write for a broader audience. So I knew that I would have to kind of follow in Sylvia Plath and to some extent Ted Hughes's footsteps. So I did just a lot more kind of field work, for lack of a better word. The Massachusetts spots were more familiar to me: Winthrop, Wellesley, Cape Cod, of course, one of my favorite places on earth, and Smith College. Those were all familiar to me in my backyard. When I went to England, I felt that was a more, I guess, transformative research experience for me. I had spent 4 years at Oxford in graduate school, but going up to Yorkshire was a really different experience. I mean, Oxford and Yorkshire kind of pulls apart. So that was all quite new to me. I spent 5 weeks living in Ted Hughes's childhood home. Oh, wow. In the village of Mytham Royd in West Yorkshire. The University of Huddersfield had very generously invited me to be a visiting professor in 2017 and put me up there. And I was actually able to bring my kids and my mom and my husband for some of it. So that made the research a lot, just practically speaking, easier. But I slept in the room that Ted Hughes was born in. I got to meet a lot of local people who had a connection to Hughes or Hughes and Plath. I took amazing walks over the moors. I would literally take the hikes that Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes took over the moorland. And I just tried to immerse myself in that landscape as much as possible. So that was fantastic. And then seeing the house where Sylvia Plath her last house, 23 Fitzroy Road in London, where she wrote some of her greatest poems. I believe very few Plath scholars or biographers have been allowed to inside that house, but the owner of the house very generously gave me a tour. And I got to see her bedroom study where she wrote these magnificent poems, and I got to see the view from her bedroom study, which was what I really wanted to see. What was she looking at? When I knew that her desk had been positioned before a window, and so seeing that view was really powerful. And I took a picture of that. That was the one picture I took in the house, and that's in the book. And then just, meeting Sylvia Plath's friends, interviewing these people who in some cases were extremely close to her. I mean, that was one of the most incredible experiences of my life, and listening to their stories. And it was, yeah, I mean, I just will never forget those afternoons I spent, having tea with Ruth Fainlight or Suzette Macedo and Daniel Hughes, all these people who were just, again, very generously shared their time with me. And there was a lot of, like I said, there's a lot of new material, and I can talk about the Rosenstein collection later or now, but
well, I'm curious. I mean, just you were working on this book for so long.
yeah.
Not, I mean,
I was.
Eons, but I'm sure
No,
it
really
felt
was.
like a long time.
Yeah, it was a long
And
time.
you already knew Plath. You were familiar with your work, but I'm curious if your view or understanding of her changed over the course of writing this book, or if your relationship to her changed during the 8 years you were working on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like what you said in your introductory remarks. I guess I started the book with less of a sense of what she was up against and how hard she fought to honor her literary vocation and her literary calling. She never really deviated from that. She just worked so hard to become a writer, and I admire it so much. I didn't realize what a fighter she was at the beginning of the project, I think, because maybe we're all used to this image of Sylvia Plath as more fragile and sort of somebody who wasn't in control of her identity. And I think that's, at some points that was true when she was in the midst of a severe depression, but much of the time she had a very strong sense of who she was and what she wanted to do and where she was going. And her Smith friends all talk about her as just like she was a machine. If you wanted something done, you give it to Sylvia Plath. she just was this marvel. So yeah, I guess my sense of her as someone who had a real core inner strength and iron will.
I definitely found that as well reading the book. I was full of such admiration for her. She really impressed me by what she was able to accomplish, and the kind of strength and dedication that you show is really, I mean, it's awe-inspiring. It's really remarkable. One of the claims you make in the biography that I find so important and fascinating, and in full agreement with, is that her poetry about motherhood is really groundbreaking.
Yeah.
And the book is a lot about her relationship to motherhood and to sort of her relationship to her own mother, but also to motherhood as a kind of institution that, as you were just reading in the beginning, in the 50s, being a mother and being a homemaker was taking on this new status as the thing that all women were supposed to be doing, as the most patriotic thing they could do. And she was really gung-ho for that in a lot of ways, and also fully committed to being the greatest artist who ever lived, which is it's really difficult to do both, as we all know.
As we all know, still,
maybe now more than ever.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, what did you come to think about Plath and motherhood, or Plath's poetry about motherhood, and does that inform at all your own thinking about being a mother in your own life, or the way you think about these ideas personally.
Yes, Anne Stevenson, the late poet Anne Stevenson, wrote of Sylvia Plath. She said Sylvia Plath wrote the first great poems of childbirth in the language. And I don't know if that's true, but it sounds right to me, because I think that Plath really pioneered the poetry of motherhood, and Anne Sexton did to a certain extent as well. But Plath was one of the first poets to write about miscarriage and postpartum depression and childbirth itself, and a lot of these subjects that are still today so sentimentalized and sanitized. I mean, if you read Three Women, which was her verse play, and I can't believe it was written so long ago. It feels so modern. It feels almost still taboo reading that today. It's a long verse poem about a woman who, three women, one who had her baby, one who gave her baby up for adoption, and one who had a miscarriage. And that work is such a turning point, I think, in post-war poetry. So yeah, I think she did pioneer the poetry of motherhood in that way. She wanted to be a mother, she wanted to be a wife, and she wanted to be a writer. She wanted it all. And part of her feminism, I think, now of course she came of age, or sorry, she died tragically before the onset of second wave feminism. But I think her feminism was wanting to have those things and not having to choose between them, between the writing career and the family. She could be very cruel about women who did not have children, barren women, she called them. And she mocked her Cambridge University professors, her female professors. She called them grotesques. So she had this she could be nasty about women who, as I said, pursued careers, but chose that path, right? And didn't try to to have the family as well. But I think, again, that was part of her feminism. She was angry that she had to choose, right? And she didn't want to choose. So she was really breaking barriers, raising children and writing. And Marianne Moore and Elizabeth Bishop, she admired their poetry, no end. But she said that she didn't want to be like them, in the sense that she wanted children. She wanted to be a wife. And so she really embraced that role wholeheartedly, at least in the beginning. I think it got a lot harder for her after Ted left, and then she had the children all day. And one of the leitmotifs in her later letters is, I need a nanny. I need a nanny, I need a nanny, I need a nanny. I mean, it's like every single letter almost. And that connected. I connected with that sense. I really, I connected with that profoundly. Just that worry, that anxiety of, how am I going to get this work done? And when I have no help. I mean, I have had a lot more help than Sylvia Plath, but even then, it's still really hard with young children afoot. But she inspired me, because look what she did with 2 toddlers. I mean, she wrote Ariel.
Right.
And so she was still able to kind of push through and manage her time and do all of that. And she did, in the early years of the marriage, Ted did share a lot of the child rearing with Sylvia, and she had the morning, she wrote every morning, and then he took the afternoon. I think after they had their second child, it just became a lot harder to keep that balance, and that's sort of when things started to fall apart. But yeah, absolutely, I connected with her on that level. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's one of the wonderful qualities of the way you tell the story, that it feels so, what you were just saying about 3 women, it feels so modern, it feels so fresh and so relevant. I wonder if that also was a challenge for you as a writer, whether you ever worried about sort of, especially as you talk about sexism and the sort of forces she was up against, were you ever sort of worried about imposing contemporary ideas onto the past? I guess how did you figure out how to occupy the 1950s and 1960s while still keeping the perspective of the 2010s and 2020 when this book comes out?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, because I would, I would just constantly be reading through this material, and I just think, what? How can how could no one have really complained about this? Even just the women's magazines, right? Looking at the ads for the corset, these undergarments that were basically corsets, and it just gave me a sense of how hard it was for women to actually move, just to move. So yeah, I was just shocked all the time. I would note, I think, moments when I was imposing my own view. For example, I'll give you an example from the book. So Sylvia Plath applied for a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship her last year at Smith. She wanted to go to graduate school. She was applying for all kinds of fellowships, right? She applied for a Fulbright. And so during her Woodrow Wilson interview at Harvard, by the way, she was interviewed by a panel of men. And this threw her off because, she came from Smith College, which was very nurturing women's college. And she she called them smug. And she said that they just would not stop asking her questions along the lines of, well, how do you expect to become a writer if you're going to get married and have babies? And she was really she was angry about it, right? She wrote to her mother how intense it was, and she never used the word sexist or misogynist or anything like this, but she was quite angry. And then somehow Radcliffe's dean got wind of this interview. I wasn't able to quite connect how, but anyway, Radcliffe's dean wrote Plath a letter saying, don't worry, Miss Plath, your interview was fine, your record is impeccable. It's just that generally these scholarships just go to men. And so don't worry, they go to men because men go into business and finance and law and medicine. And Plath wrote to her mother, oh, thank goodness, it wasn't my character, it was just that the scholarships went to men. And so my 2020 sensibility is to think, wow, I can't believe that she wasn't so much angry about the sexism, but just relieved that it wasn't something that she had said or done. And that was a moment when I sort of annotated because I just couldn't hold back. And I said it was just shockingly sexist and something like that. So during those when there were these egregious examples, I did leave my own take, I suppose.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was hard just kind of keeping a distance, and also understanding that this was normal in 1952, 53, 54 when she's at Smith College. And one of her contemporaries told me she went to Barnard. This was a friend of Sylvia Plath, and she remembered talking to Barnard's president, and the woman said, oh, please, dear, don't call me professor. Don't call me doctor, call me Mrs., because that's the title I'm most proud of. And so I think that the messages were just so mixed, right? These women were encouraged to achieve at places like Smith and Barnard, but also, not to achieve too much, right? To take your place, to step back, as Adlai Stevenson told them. Yeah.
So yes, I think mixed messages is exactly it. Such a confusing time to have more women than ever attending college, but also have all of these messages that their real places are in the home.
Yeah.
You mentioned Harvard, and I feel like since we are at the Harvard bookstore, we should talk a little bit about Plath's connections to the Boston area, to Harvard and Radcliffe. She spent some time here. And she's also a native of the Metro Boston area. I remember going to high school and seeing her plaque on my high school door every day.
Oh, wow.
So I have a certain memory of her from that teenage time.
Yes.
So yeah, can you tell us a little bit about her life in Boston and her connections to Cambridge?
Yes, well, she attended Harvard Summer School in the summer of 1954, and she had a great time. I mean, she was going to bars every night. I mean, she really she kind of let loose that summer. She really enjoyed it. Of course, the previous summer, she had applied to Harvard Summer School, and Frank O'Connor rejected her application for a creative writing class. And that was partly what triggered her first really severe depression that led to her first suicide attempt. Was that rejection connected to Harvard Summer School. But again, Plath, being the fighter that she is, or was, decided, and this is after a suicide attempt, after shock therapy, after a few months at McLean Hospital, said, no, I'm going back. I'm not a quitter. And she reapplied and she got in, and she had a wonderful summer at Harvard Summer School. So there's that connection. Her brother went to Harvard, Warren Plath. He went to Harvard as an undergraduate. And she socialized at Harvard a lot because she had a lot of male friends from the Wellesley area, close friends who ended up going to Harvard. So she went to a lot of Adams House dances and things like that. Let's see, what else? Oh, she worked as a secretary for the head of the Sanskrit department at Harvard in 1959. She and Ted Hughes lived in Boston from about September 1958 to July 1959. They had been teaching at Smith College, and both decided that, Sylvia Plath had been teaching at Smith College. Ted Hughes had been teaching at UMass Amherst. And they both decided that they were going to quit these teaching jobs and try to make a living as full-time freelance writers, which again is a very brave decision. So they moved to Boston, they moved to Beacon Hill, they lived on Willow Street, and they socialized with the who's who of Boston poetry at the time. And Robert Lowell, Elizabeth Hardwick, Adrienne Rich, Jack Sweeney, Robert Frost, Peter Davison. And then Plath, of course, everyone probably knows, she took Robert Lowell's creative writing class in the spring of 1959. And that's where she met, or that's where she became friends with Anne Sexton. And she and Anne Sexton and George Starbuck would very famously go out for martinis afterward at the Ritz, where they would park in the loading zone because they were only there to get loaded, as Anne Sexton famously said. I think that's still funny all these years later. But I think Plath learned a lot in Boston during her Boston year, because I think that creative writing group was so important to her. I mean, Lowell was workshopping parts of life studies in that class. I mean, can you imagine reading Skunk Hour in class? It just and Anne Sexton was also workshopping poems from her first book, like The Double Image and You, Dr. Martin. And so Plath read these poems about mental illness, depression, institutionalization, suicide attempts. And these were all things that she had experienced, but she had never really dared to write about. And I think reading the Lowell poems and the Sexton poems and the sort of honesty that they approached these taboo experiences, that's Plath's word, she calls them taboo, that really opened something up for her. And then later in the year, she goes to Yaddo and she starts to write in a kind of new voice. And I think Lowell and Sexton had a lot to do with that. So long story short, the Boston year was very important.
Basically a good year.
Yeah, it was.
When I'll ask you one more question, and then I think we'll open it up for audience questions if anyone wants to put in a question to the Q&A. But one thing that I, as someone who also writes biography of different kinds, one of the things that I really admire about your work in this biography is how fair and compassionate and sensitive you are when discussing really intimate aspects of your subject's life. How did you are writing about mental illness, marriage, difficult family relationships, and you had access to materials that allowed you to write about them with a lot of detail. How did you think about that as a writer, as a biographer? How did you sort of handle that responsibility, and how did you figure out what kind of attitude and what kind of sort of perspective to have when engaging with this kind of material?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Thank you for asking that. I mean, that was part of the reason I at first tried to talk myself out of writing a biography of Sylvia Plath, because it was just so intimidating. I mean, there were just so many facets of this story that seemed almost too hot to touch, whether it's the marriage to Hughes or depression, mental illness, suicide. I mean, I didn't know if I was up to the task. And like I said, it was very intimidating. But because I wanted to at least try to write a book where, I treated her as the professional writer first, as Hermione Lee would say, I just decided that I would stick to the evidence as much as possible, stick to the letters, that I would try to let Plath speak in her own voice as much as I could, especially in there are 14 letters that Plath sent to her psychiatrist in the 1960, 61, 62, and one very shortly before her death. Those came to light very recently, and they were published in 2018. But those are letters in which she talks about these very sensitive and heartbreaking issues: the breakdown of her marriage, the onset of depression. So I tried to let Plath speak for herself. I quoted a lot from those letters. Probably in the most that I quote from letters in the book are those 14 letters, and you'll see they're sort of big block quotes. And I just felt like I wanted her voice to tell the story. And I guess the other thing I would say about that is I began this book with the ideological sense that I just didn't want to blame anyone for her suicide. I didn't want to blame one of the usual villains, for lack of a better word. And I just didn't want to do that. And maybe people don't agree with that approach, but I just thought this is something that I can't blame on one of the people who usually takes the blame for that. So yeah, that's sort of how I tried to handle it.
That's a very fair and thoughtful way of handling these kind of writings and this kind of issue. So I think we'll go to the Q&A. And one question that I also wanted to ask you was about your prior relationship with Plath. When did you first start reading her? And she's been someone that you've written about in a scholarly context as well. Is that something that you knew right away when you encountered her, that she was going to be your life's work in a sense? Or tell us a little bit about your early relationship with Plath.
Yeah, I mean, not at all. I first remember reading her when I was backpacking in Ireland one summer, and I found a dog-eared copy of her journals in the youth hostel common room, the library. And so this must have been one of my sophomore, junior years of college. I wrote for Let's Go travel guides, and the Harvard travel guide I wrote in Ireland for Let's Go for several summers. And anyway, I picked this up, and I was blown away by the way she wrote about her hunger for life, her desires, her boyfriends. I hadn't really read a woman writer's diary before, and I was really really impressed by it, and it sort of stuck with me. But I don't remember reading much Sylvia Plath in high school or college. And anyway, I moved. I was writing a thesis on James Joyce, and then I went to Ireland and studied more Irish poetry. Wrote my doctoral dissertation on Northern Irish poets, and I was asked to teach a class on Sylvia Plath at Oxford, and because she was on the curriculum there, which I think is great. I mean, at least she used to be. So I learned everything I could because I just completely over prepared for this class because I didn't feel like I was qualified to teach her, and I just went crazy reading everything. And that's when I became hooked, when I had to teach it to undergraduates. And that's when I realized, oh my God, this is one of the most important and innovative poets of the 20th century. And why haven't I read more of her? And I just wanted, I'm interested in literary relationships and whether, the extent to which poets influence each other. And so I thought, I'd done that with the Belfast book. I'd sort of focused on this group of poets in Belfast during the Troubles. And I thought that Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes would make an interesting study in that sense. And then that's what kind of launched the next book after that. So, yeah.
And I think that leads nicely into the next question, which is about her influence. What poets do you see who are working today who you could track back to Plath? How do you see her legacy, or who would you put in a lineage, a Plath lineage?
The first poet actually who comes to mind is Evan Boland, and I think that this is a case in point where Plath's poetry of motherhood was so influential, especially to female poets who came after, Sharon Olds as well. But I'm thinking of Boland's poems like Night Feed, for example, just exquisite poem about a mother feeding her daughter in the middle of the night. And also Boland, I think, was very influenced by Plath's decision to center female experience in a lot of those Ariel poems. And I think she picked up that mantle. So she's a poet that comes almost immediately to mind. But I mean, I think that so many modern poets have been, I think that Ariel, the singularity of the voice in Ariel, modern poets have been either chasing that or rebelling against that for for many years. I think she shifted the goalposts, and along the way wrote some of the most profound poems of depression about depression in the English language as well. And I think she opened up sort of new ways to write about mental illness, in addition to some of the other subjects that we know her very well for.
I think that's related to another question we have, which is that there seems to be a kind of renaissance in Plath studies that's happening right now.
Absolutely, yeah.
Why do you think that's happening now? Why now? Why might she be kind of coming back to attention?
Yeah, I think, God, there's so many great scholars right now writing about Sylvia Plath, and that was another part of the impetus for this book, was that I wanted to kind of get that scholarship in there. Maybe because, well, first, there's so many more new letters coming to, like, her 3,000 letters or however many she wrote that have been published now. So there's just a lot more work that can be done. But I also think that the sense that Plath was a much more ironic poet is gaining traction. And I think her relationship to confessionalism is something that a lot of contemporary scholars are really keen to explore. And again, to what extent she treated that idea of confessionalism ironically. I mean, she's a very performative poet. I think you can't read a poem like Lady Lazarus literally. I mean, it's performance. And I would say the same thing about Edge. I mean, again, Edge is probably the last poem Sylvia Plath wrote, and it's one of the most biographically determined poems in the English language, I think. It's often read as almost a posthumous suicide note. And it's often regarded as the epitome of the confessional verse, right? But in fact, that poem it has so many literary allusions. She's engaging in a dialogue with Yeats, with Robert Graves, with Sarah Teasdale, with D.H. Lawrence, with Shakespeare, with Ted Hughes. I mean, all of these literary allusions are in this poem, and which I think belie this idea of it being an impulsive, quote unquote, confessional poem written in 5 minutes. And in so many ways, her verse is the opposite of that. And I think so. I think a lot of the scholarship is addressing some of those ironic and more performative aspects of her work.
Yeah, I mean, it's not quite emotion recollected in tranquility, because the tranquility is not there, but there is still, it's the emotion being recollected, refiltered, put into some other form.
Yes, and she does write in such different tones too. I mean, I should say the poems like Lady Lazarus and Daddy and Ariel and Fever 103 Degrees. I mean, those are red hot, right? Those are, you feel like they're written at white heat. You feel the lines just soaring off the page. Whereas poems like Sheep and Fog, Edge, The Moon and the Yew Tree, they're still, they're flat. The tonal color of those poems to me is blue, whereas the tonal color of the other poems is red. So she did have these different voices. I don't want to suggest that she wrote in the same way all the time, but yeah.
You've mentioned Hermione Lee a few times, and we have a question about what you learned from Hermione Lee as a biographer.
Oh, I mean, I admire her work so much. I admire the dispassion, I suppose, that I find in her work, where I feel like she's letting me in, and I feel so close to the subject, but I don't feel that the sort of narrative voice really overtaking. It's almost a sleight of hand. And I admire her scholarship, that she backs everything up really well. I admire her endnotes, which isn't always the case with biography. I've read a lot of biographies where I'm like, where is this from? Where did you get this? Who said this? I have no idea what. So that frustrates me. I like knowing where everything came from. I like the documentation, but and also the compassionate way, especially that she writes about Virginia Woolf. And one thing that I took away from the Virginia Woolf biography, and I think which influenced my Plath biography, was Hermione Lee's suggestion that some of Woolf's treatments for mental illness may have affected her depression, right? That you just couldn't really disentangle the treatment from the depression, that maybe some of those treatments made her worse. And I think for Plath, I mean, that's one of the things that I argue in the book, that we have to at least allow for the possibility that some of these treatments she received, including the mismanaged shock therapy at Valley Head in 1953, made her worse, and were really traumatic. And we don't really understand the drug interactions at the end of her life. And so she went through insulin coma therapy, which humiliated her at McLean. I think she had 6 shock treatments at McLean. All of these, I think she suffered. I think she was helped in some ways, but she suffered in others. So I think it made me understand Sylvia Plath's fear of institutionalization at the end of her life, when she was about to go back into a mental hospital. I felt like I had a much better sense of why she wouldn't want to do that, and really feared that loss of autonomy, given the treatments that she had, given what she had endured. And that's something that I think Hermione Lee's Virginia Woolf book clarified for me. And also I should mention Elaine Showalter's wonderful book, The Female Malady, and that was an influence too.
Yeah, the stuff about her time institutionalized in the 50s was really horrifying. I mean, I was thinking, you know, how many people do I know, myself included, who have sought, you know, help during periods of depression or anxiety, and the fact that now we can access those things in a, you know, or if we're lucky and insured and all those things, but we're not in danger of sort of turning over our autonomy, as you said, all of our health and well-being to people who might not protect us in some ways. Yeah. There's a wonderful question about Plath's voice in your biography, which you bring forward so well. And, you know, did you ever feel like you were in competition with Plath as a writer? So
oh my God, no.
How did you, I mean, that's one of the things I loved about the book is reading Plath's words, reading her journals and her letters. How did you manage including her without feeling sort of overrun by her or in competition with her?
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely, biographers have different strategies, right? Some biographers hate to quote, and they just don't like it. They feel like it slows the reader down. And I am of the opposite school, I think, especially in this case, because I don't think, okay, Anne Stevenson's biography did quote quite a bit from Plath, but other than that, we haven't really heard Plath in her own words until this biography. I mean, in the biography. So I really wanted to take advantage of that and just let Plath's words tell the story in particularly in these very important, charged, intimate, emotional moments. And then I would try to just take an authorial step back. But I tried to use the quotes in a kind of collage-like way. Sometimes I almost felt like it was a documentary, you know, that I would pick them very carefully and try to make sure that they elucidated point that I was trying to make, that I thought Plath was trying to make. So yeah, I never felt in competition with her voice at all. And I was always very intimidated by her brilliance. I mean, she was one of the greatest, I mean, apart from being one of the greatest poets of the 20th century, she was one of the greatest critical minds of her generation, without a doubt. I mean, she graduated summa cum laude from Smith College after spending months in an institution, recovering from depression. She still managed to graduate summa cum laude. I mean, she was astonishing. So yeah, I wanted to try to lift her voice and kind of put that first.
I think we probably have one last question here. It's an intriguing one, which is that Auden in his poem wrote of Yeats that he became his admirers. How might that apply to Plath, or how could we think about Plath in that light?
Yes, you know, I start the book with Yeats. The first sentence of the book is, in December 1962, Sylvia Plath moved into William Butler Yeats's old house. And there's a reason that I started the book with that sentence. And I went through a lot of first sentences, and because I think the first sentence of a big biography like this is really important. And I had a lot of false starts. And then when I found that, I thought that was appropriate, partly because of that, I was thinking of that, Yeats becoming his admirers, because I think that is true for Sylvia Plath. I mean, she's just had such an incredible impact, not just on literature, but popular culture as well. I mean, my God, if she only had lived to see how many lives she touched. I mean, she died in relative obscurity, and that's, for me, that's part of the heartbreak of the story. If she only knew. But that first sentence, I really wanted to bring Yeats into the mix because I wanted to, I guess I wanted to suggest that Plath is very much Yeats's heir, um, and that she is as important a poet as Yeats and Eliot, and that it almost provided me with a perfect metaphor moving into Yeats's old house, right? That there's this sense of continuum, and that she did, I think she did succeed in achieving her ambition and poetic greatness. And so yeah, I think she has become her admirers.
Thank you so much, Heather, for talking with us about this biography. It's really been such a pleasure.
Oh, thank you so much, Maggie, for helping to host this. And thank you, Harvard Bookstore, as well, my old stomping grounds.
Thank you both. I just want to thank you, Heather and Maggie, for this fantastic conversation. And I want to thank all of you out there for spending your evening with us. Please learn more about this incredible book and pre-order Red Comet at harvard.com. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, have a good night. Keep reading and stay safe. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for watching.